We'll start by discussing Climate Change Justice by Eric Posner and Cass Sunstein. This article offers a criticism of commonly held views about climate change justice, such as the view that we must enter into global climate pacts and treaties to collectively work to stop the future negative effects of climate change. First, a word on two different kinds of concepts of justice addressed in this article. First, distributive justice. Distributive justice has to do with the just distribution of resources. There are, of course, limited resources and billions of people, and we can divide those resources up justly or unjustly. Many, for instance, argue that the distribution of resources between the rich and poor in the US today is unjust. And so this is an appeal to this particular kind of justice. Second, corrective justice. This kind of justice has to do with righting wrongs. There's an argument still alive in the US regarding reparations for ancestors of slaves. The uncontroversial argument is that slaves were wronged and slave owners benefited from that wrong. The more controversial argument is that descendants of those slave owners owe something to descendants of those slaves to right that wrong, given that wealth and at least privileges are transferred generationally. The argument for reparations is based on the concept of corrective justice. Both of these apply to the debate over what we should do about climate change. Let's take them in order as Posner and Sunstein do. Regarding distributive justice, the worry is that we distribute resources in a just way. Hence, the concern is with making sure the poorest people of the world have adequate resources. Posner and Sunstein argue that dedicating billions of dollars into addressing the effects of climate change and reversing the course we are on is not the best way to justly distribute resources. First, they argue that climate change will harm some but benefit others, so it's not an absolute disaster. They argue that, quote, millions of people would benefit from climate change, including those people who live in extremely cold climates and people whose land will become increasingly fertile and productive with the warming of the globe. They don't deny that many will suffer, but they note that some who will suffer are already wealthy and privileged, and some are poor. The point is that devoting great amounts of resources towards stopping the trend of climate change will not create a more just distribution of resources around the world, helping to empower the poor. Also, climate change proposals that would put major financial burdens on Americans will also harm some of the world's poor, America's poor. If the goal is to empower the poor, they argue that there are better ways of doing that than by addressing climate change. Instead of addressing a trend that will change the lives of millions in the future, some of whom are poor and some of whom are rich, we can dedicate our time and resources to helping the poor who are alive today with their unique problems, which include access to health care, education, strong democratic institutions, etc. As they put it, quote, in principle, greenhouse gas cuts do not seem to be the most direct or effective means of helping poor people or poor nations, end quote. Now, they do recognize that if climate change is seen as an absolute disaster, that would change things. They note, to the extent that the risk of catastrophe is not low, and to the extent that it is faced mostly by people living in difficult or desperate conditions, the argument from distributive justice does gain a great deal of force, end quote. Meaning that if climate change is predicted to be an absolute disaster and one that primarily affects poor people, then it seems we should devote resources now to stopping it. That seems to be the way things have gone with the scientific research since this paper was published. Scientists are now talking about the compound effects of climate change and its predicted widespread disastrous consequences. So this might mean that distributive justice does require a concerted and expensive effort to curb emissions. However, as Posner and Sunstein argue, if an absolute disaster is not likely and some part of the population will suffer and another benefit from climate change, then their argument is that distributive justice does not demand the pouring of resources into addressing climate change. Now let's look at corrective justice. The argument here is that it's not clear that action on climate change is justified by corrective justice. Indeed, the US is a major emitter of greenhouse gases, and so a huge contributor to climate change. The authors note, in the context of climate change, the corrective justice argument is that the United States wrongfully harmed the rest of the world, especially low-lying states and others that are most vulnerable to global warming, by emitting greenhouse gases in vast quantities. On a widespread view, corrective justice requires that the United States devote significant resources to remedying the problem, perhaps by paying damages, agreeing to extensive emissions reductions, or participating in a climate pact that is not in its self-interest. However, the authors argue that corrective justice doesn't bear this out in a clear way. For one, there's no clear connection between a wrongdoer and someone who is injured. For instance, I am an American and I have commuted for literally thousands of miles on my bicycle. I hang up my clothes in the summer so as not to use an energy-sucking dryer. I also grow as much food as I can on my small property. Still, I am an American benefiting from our energy-inefficient way of life. Am I a wrongdoer? And who exactly have I injured? Should I be punished as much as my neighbor who uses more energy than me? And how can I accurately and precisely determine how much pain and suffering I have caused someone negatively impacted by climate change to determine exactly how much I should pay? As you can see, things get murky quickly. Ultimately, this paper is narrow in its focus. It looks at climate change and the appropriate response to it from a legal perspective. It does not apply utilitarianism, virtue ethics, or other theories that we've studied. It looks at the issue from the perspectives of distributive justice and corrective justice only. It's most closely aligned then with deontology, which is the moral theory that focuses on fairness and justice.